I'm a forensic toxicologist. I have a background and training in analytical chemistry and pharmacology and toxicology. So what forensic toxicologists do is study the adverse effects of drugs and poisons and how that applies in the investigation of criminal cases. So, for example, forensic toxicologists are part of a team that contribute towards death investigation. So we'll take information from the scene of a suspicious death, we'll take information from the autopsy, and we'll apply that information to decide what kind of testing to perform on tissues and fluids that are collected at autopsy to disclose the presence of drugs or poisons that might have caused or contributed to a person's death. So that could be anything from drug overdose to an occupational exposure to toxic chemicals. And then once the results in the lab are generated, we typically measure how much of the drug is present. We look at things like how might drugs interact with one another to cause a toxic reaction, how might drugs and alcohol together have combined to have caused a person's death. And we provide that information back to the medical examiner, and then they take all of that information, the patient's history, the scene, indicators from the scene, findings they made at autopsy from histology, and the toxicology, and they'll determine the most appropriate cause and manner of death. Two other areas where forensic toxicologists work are in what's called human performance toxicology, which would be the investigation of how a person's drug or alcohol use contributed to their impairment. Say, for example, in a motor vehicle collision where there are fatalities and somebody's driving behavior was affected by their use of drugs. So in those circumstances, we'll get information about the symptoms and signs somebody's maybe displaying as a result of their drug or alcohol use. We'll examine the drug content of a blood sample, see what the levels are, how heavily it's been metabolized, whether there are multiple drugs present. And based on those findings, we're then in a position to give an opinion about A, whether the person was impaired, and B, if the drugs or alcohol present or a combination of both contributed to their impairment. So an example of a case like that I was involved in recently involved a large number of fatalities that were caused by a commercial truck that failed to stop at a stoplight, went through the intersection, plowed through a group of motorcyclists, and resulted in the deaths of 5 people. The subsequent investigation suggested that the driver of the truck had been using methamphetamine. And so my role in that case as a forensic toxicologist was to interpret the findings from the laboratory in terms of how much drug was present, and then relate that to the effects that it would have had on his driving. So the toxicologist in a case like that is really there to educate the jury and the judge about the relationship between drug use and the kinds of effects it has that can impair a person's driving and result in the cause of a crash. I think the things that draw people to the forensic sciences in general as a profession is that you really feel that your education and training is really being put to some practical good. It's really doing something in support of society. It's making sure that people are appropriately sanctioned for if they commit a crime, that the state has the information necessary to convince a jury of the fact that the crime was committed and what the nature of the crime was. We do a lot of work during the investigation to ensure that people who might fall under suspicion, if they're not involved in the crime, can be exonerated or eliminated as suspects from the investigation. So applying science in a way that improves quality of life for people, that ensures that justice is appropriately applied, that's a very rewarding part of this field.